Okay, so in the this part of the video, this third part of the video, and maybe if I'm on time, the last part of this video, we're going to look at unemployment. So, looking at the Chapter 20 file that you can get under the Contents tab in D2L. The reason why I wanted to do this is so that you can kind of see this much more beautiful chart than me looking at the whiteboard. So, if you can, I think I can get something better here in terms of, or maybe not. In terms of the, I guess look at this little hand right here. Okay, so in terms of the, how we actually measure unemployment, what we basically do is we take our total population, and then we break it down into two categories. Those who we consider basically unable to work, this green portion right here, either because they're in the hospital, they're in prison, Uncle Sam, armed forces, so they can't take on work like that, or they're kids. So these individuals are considered not even eligible to be working. Now we've got the remainder, which is the civilian, non-institutional population. This is essentially our pool of at least physically and legally capable individuals for work. And now we break that into two categories. Not in the labor force. This is going to include individuals that are like independently wealthy, the incredibly lazy, the retired, the incredibly rich, the lazy, students. Let's see, if you're a house husband or a housewife and you're just choosing not to be in the labor market. All of these individuals not in the labor force. Now there's one that I'm neglecting here, but I'm going to add that in a short bit here. But then you have then a pool of individuals who are not only physically and legally capable of working, but who are either actually working, employed, or not working but actively looking for work. To be unemployed, you have to be actively looking for work, right? So your loser brother who, sits in the basement and watches Maury Povich, all day, and then Judge Joe Brown, and then Judge Judy, and then, closes it all up with a good dose of Springer and Jersey Shore, he not only is not working, but he's too lazy to even look for work, not in the labor force. He's not unemployed. He's not in the labor force. He actually has to be looking for work, right? Be in a misfitted suit and with a pretend briefcase, handing out resumes and business cards. That person would then be considered unemployed. Now, it's not just the lazy non-worker who's not in the labor force, but increasingly important right now, we would also count here the discouraged worker. This would be someone like, for our parents' age group, right? If they're in their 50s and they all of a sudden became unemployed and they worked in, like, manufacturing, it might be incredibly difficult for them to find a job. And they might look for an incredibly long time, and they might not even find anything. And they might get so discouraged about looking for a job that they actually move to not in the labor force. Now, that's going to become important for us as we start to calculate some of these statistics. Now, how do they measure this? So essentially, just as we measured with CPI, where individuals go out and buy stuff, what they do is they actually create a sample, and they call people up on the phone. As you can see here, they basically ask you, did you work for pay or profit? Did you work at least 15 hours? If you say, no, I didn't, then they say, well, okay, are you just not working because you were sick the past few days, or there was an industrial dispute, or bad weather, right? Just to get an idea of whether you are employed. And then if you say you're unemployed, or if you say you're not working, then they try to say, okay, are you actively looking for work? Would you be willing to go back for work if they called you back to going to work? Right? And based on your series of answers, they're going to place you in one of these categories of either not in the labor force, employed, or unemployed. Sorry about that. The screen is converting everything for YouTube here. So the placement then in these categories then requires us to then start to do the calculations of civilian labor force and not in the labor force. Okay, so what do those statistics look like? Well, for our purposes, right, to be considered unemployed, what we're going to focus on here is, let me erase this here. Actually, no, since I've got this set up like this where it looks much more beautiful, let me just pull down to this point here. If I have it calculated. I don't. Okay, well, let's just go over it then. For the unemployment rate, we would be looking at the ratio of the unemployed, so that would be in the numerator, over the civilian labor force. So unemployed over the civilian labor force is our unemployment rate. Then for the employment rate, we're going to have the employed, but it's now going to be over the civilian non-institutional population. Take note of the different denominator, the different number in the lower part of the ratio. The employment rate would be employed over the civilian non-institutional population. And then the third statistic that's important to know would be the labor force participation rate. That's simply the civilian labor force over the civilian non-institutional population. Now with those three statistics, economists get a pretty good idea about the labor market. Now, when we look at the unemployment rate, one of the things that we look at, and this is what appears here then, is that we want to know why people are not working. That would then mean that we're looking at four different categories: the loser, the leaver, the re-entrant, and the new entrant. Why they are unemployed, right? We would want to know that as policymakers so that we knew how to design the systems appropriately, right, to get them to find a job. So in our cases, right, if you're a loser because you were fired or laid off, right, then that means we need to teach you like time management skills, or retrain you for a sector that you're not going to lose employment. If you're a leaver, right, we need to find some way to make you feel more satisfied in your job so that you don't quit. If you're a re-entrant, then that would mean that, right, in this case, you had a job where you had some experience and you need to find a new employer. Those skills required are going to be very different than, let's say, you going out into the labor market for the first time as a new entrant. We add up the losers, the leavers, the re-entrants, and the new entrants to get the total number of unemployed individuals. Those unemployed individuals being, again, our number of unemployed divided by our civilian labor force. Now, just as we went over all these things here, one of the things that was important for us through all of these statistics, we saw that GDP, for instance, tends to underestimate actual production. CPI tends to overestimate the actual change in the prices. The unemployment rate tends to underestimate the actual problem. And what you'll see right now, actually, again, I'm not trying to be political, but what's interesting right now, actually, is that you'll see that the Obama administration is trying to say, oh, things are actually getting much better because the unemployment rate is falling. And then the conservatives then say, well, it's not really, because actually what's happening is that people are so discouraged that they're leaving the job market entirely. When a worker becomes discouraged and they leave the labor force, what happens is that the unemployment rate, curiously enough, falls. So actually, during a really bad recession, at some point the unemployment rate will actually fall because it is so serious. And on the other side, when the labor market is starting to do well, curiously what happens is that the unemployment is going to rise because individuals who were previously discouraged will start to look for work. Now, the unemployment rate doesn't take into account the fact that some individuals are, not getting the number of hours that they need, that sort of thing. So we also calculate something called the underemployment rate. Okay, the I still have 2 more big topics. I want to keep these videos out to about 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm going to finish with the last part for this chapter, chapter 20.